Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you all to this event on the future of food security. I am Carolyn Rodriguez-Burkett from the FAO, and I'll be moderating this session. Food is always an important topic and has become even more so in recent months as the world sought answers to many of the pressing issues that we face. As you know, hunger, after a couple decades of decline, is on the increase again, with 820 million people suffering from this scourge. Obesity and overweight are both on the increase, exempting no country or region. Food loss and waste remain a big problem, with almost 1/3 of all food produced either lost or wasted. And added to that, we are slated to have just about 10 billion people on this planet by 2050. Put this against the backdrop of a changing climate that's decimating lives and livelihood throughout the world. The question then becomes, how do we provide enough food, safe food, and healthy food for everyone now and in the future? What are the implications for people and for planet? Land use implications, biodiversity implications, food security implications, climate implications, justice and equity in development. And how do we manage this broad set of objectives, knowing that there will be trade-offs with others? And who will do this? Is this the responsibility of states, the private sector, the international community, or all of them together? Who is responsible for managing such a broad set of objectives, such as hunger, development, climate change, and biodiversity? I've raised many questions to help us understand these issues and to provide some answers, as it were. We have a distinguished group of panelists here with us this evening. Time will not allow me to do justice to their full biographies, but I will do some brief introductions. And I will start at my extreme left with Professor Timothy Swanson, who is a professor of international economics at the Graduate Institute here. Tim is the Andre Hoffman Chair of Environmental Economics and co-director of CIES at the Graduate Institute. He has been a professor of law and economics at Cambridge and London universities before coming to the Graduate Institute in 2010. He focuses on topics dealing with regulation, both national and international, much of the latter looking at IPR and the Convention on Biological Diversity. He has worked for 2 decades on issues dealing with research and development in global agriculture, focusing on the importance of the diffusion of agriculture innovations in developing countries. He has advised FAO, the UK Department of Trade and Industry, and various agriculture research centers within the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, CGIAR. And next to Tim is Jonathan Woolley, and Jonathan is the director of the Quaker United Nations office here in Geneva. Jonathan's background is in applied biology. He has spent 36 years resident in developing countries. His experience includes work with the CGIAR, regional and national institutions, focusing on agricultural R&D, such as participatory research, farming systems, water. He has designed and reviewed the development projects in 50 countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And his present NGO leadership responsibility includes climate, economic systems, peace, and human rights. And next to Jonathan is Professor Susan Hecht. She's the Professor of International History and Associated Faculty of the Center for International Environment Studies right here at the Graduate Institute. Susanna's research focuses largely on land use change in Latin American tropics. She's one of the founding thinkers of political ecology, now a widespread interdisciplinary approach in geography, anthropology, development studies, and environmental sciences. She has consistently carved out new analytic terrain through highly active tropical and archival research. Her areas of interest include political ecologies, of land use change, environmental history, indigenous comparative knowledge systems, indigenous politics, resistance, and rural development, rural resource governance, climate change and forest politics, and gender and natural resources. And next to Susan is Sir Charles Godfrey. And Charles is the director of the Oxford Martin School, the University of Oxford. Charles is a population biologist with a background in experimental and theoretical ecology, evolution, and epidemiology. He has a particular interest in food security and chaired the UK government's 2011 Foresight Report on the future of food and farming, and currently chairs the Science Advisory Group of the UK's Agriculture and Environment Ministry, DEFRA. At the Oxford Martin School, he brings together interdisciplinary teams from across the university to help tackle the major challenges of the 21st century. And to my immediate left is Mr. Hans Jor. And Hans is the corporate head of agriculture at Nestle. He's responsible for providing technical and strategic leadership in the group's worldwide agricultural raw material supply chain. Before joining Nestle in 2000, he was president of the International Food and Agribusiness Management Association, IFAMA, and president of the Swiss-Brazilian Chamber of Commerce in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Hans was also a member of the International Policy Council on Agriculture, Food and Trade, IPC, and a member of the Comité National Suisse de la FAO. His educational background is in farming and agricultural economics, with a doctorate in economic science and several complementary managed programs. Ladies and gentlemen, that's our panel. So let us move straight to them now and start with the issue of land use. As many of you might know, the amount of arable land in agriculture cropland is now about 1.6 billion hectares, and pastures about 3.4 billion hectares, amounting to about 40% of the Earth's surface. In recent decades, this area has been increasing at a global rate of about 3% per annum. And most of this land use change has occurred in the tropics. So what does this imply for these important resource objectives? And we'll start with Susanna on deforestation of tropics. Susanna.
Well, let's see, yes, it is. The first question I think one might want to ask is, if you were in Sao Paulo in August this year, why was it dark at 3 p.m.? So dark that you had street lights went on and everyone was using their headlights. The reason had to do with the dramatic rise in deforestation this year in Amazonia and in greater Amazonia. Not all that soot was from the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon. Quite a bit of it was from the Bolivian Amazon. The point here is really, you had to ask, how many hectares does it take to cause such darkness at noon or 3 p.m.? And the answer is close to 6 million hectares. And what you also have to realize is most of this was converted intentionally. This is a human arson. And more centrally, although part of it is linked to the development of agriculture, it was also largely linked to land speculation and a decriminalization of land laws in much of the Amazon, both in Bolivia and in Brazil. So what this meant was a large-scale transfer of land from protected areas, indigenous areas, sustainable development areas, into a land economic matrix that is less focused at this moment in intensive production and more interested in speculative gains. So this is not exactly perhaps the drama of food security that we would like to see. The second thing about this is that this dynamic of deforestation is drastically changing the internal forest climate in Amazonia, which is which generates about 50% of its own rainfall, which as it hits the Andes, veers down across the Cerrado and into the major watersheds of Brazil's mega cities in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. What we can expect, and what is quite worrisome in these new studies that are coming out, is that Amazonia might very well flip from being a forest pumping water and absorbing carbon into being a net carbon source, and also dramatically changing the hydrological systems of the region in ways that make even the large-scale farming areas in the Cerrado and in southern Amazonia unsustainable on the basis of its water systems. So it's quite important to realize that perhaps we need to really review the model of tropical development away from monocultures of soy and monocultures of beef into a system that doesn't just look at agricultural modernity as genomics and ecocidal and, how shall we say, ecocidal drenching of these systems that is necessary in order to grow the GMO soybean that dominates these regions, but might usefully rethink the kinds of ecological platforms that are based in forest systems that are also highly productive, and in fact, much more productive on a per hectare basis.
And Susan, I think you right at this point, I think we should bring in Tim.
Okay.
From the biodiversity standpoint. So Tim, do you want to speak of the implications for tropics on biodiversity, following on Susan?
Okay, sure. Although Susanna is the professor of history, I think I'd like to take the very long view on this and point out that one of the major forces that we see with regards to the changing human population on the globe is the impact upon the rest of the species on the globe. It's an amazing fact of what's happened on Earth in the last 10,000 years, that the population of the human species has gone from about 10 million, which is a city the size of London, to now 10 billion people. And the expansion of the human niche, the change in the capacity of this one species to expand and appropriate from the globe necessarily means that there's a lot of losers out there. One of the main things that's going to wind up being lost is the rest of the species on Earth. And we've seen this, and there's many, many natural scientists, as our natural scientists here with us can tell us, that have been able to document both the scale of the appropriation by humans of the net photosynthetic product, and also the impact that our changing of the biosphere has upon the remainder of the species. And I'd go further than this to say not just are we a species who's expanding outside of the bounds of our natural constraints, but I'd say that our agriculture is actually particularly inimical to diversity and to other species. We've gone from where the archaeological record can show that human species 10,000 years ago lived upon hundreds and hundreds of different things that they'd been a typical omnivore, to being a species that relies for about half of our calories on 4 species, just the 4 carbohydrates alone. And that can only be the case if we displace so many other species on Earth and plant instead the maize, rice, potatoes, and wheat that sustain us. So this expansion of the human population has been necessarily combined with the loss of the planet's resources to so many other species, and in particularly the diversity of them.
Thank you very much, Tim. And you mentioned the lack of diversity in what we eat. And so I think the whole food system approach is important, looking at all aspects. So perhaps, Charles, you may want to talk a bit about the food systems.
So I was going to say something about greenhouse gas emissions and the food system. And approximately a third of all greenhouse gas emissions associated with humanity are to do with food, both its consumption, the food chain, and its production. And that divides into sort of two roughly equal components, one of which is deforestation. And if you want another argument to back up what Tim and Susanna have said about the dangers of deforestation and biodiversity, it's also, as Nick Stern a couple of years back said, the most efficient way of getting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But there is a corollary of that. If we try and not convert any more land that is currently forest, currently wetland, then it means that we're going to have to feed a population that, as Tim said, by mid-century will be 10 billion people from the remaining agricultural footprint, and perhaps a smaller agricultural footprint as we'll be losing land to urbanization and to sea level rise. So to me, that leads to some really hard choices. We're going to have to produce more food from the same amount of land and do it in ways that are sustainable. And I like to call that sustainable intensification, which I realize is a contested term, but I think it challenges both us and the biodiversity world to realize that unless we put food in people's bellies, there's no hope for biodiversity. And it challenges the industry to produce food in a very different way. Now, the other half comes from food production, and the problem there is both enormous and in one way simple. The problem is so big that we have to work on all fronts. We have to work on production. I like the term that the World Bank has popularized of climate-smart agriculture. We need to produce food in a different way that has good climate outcomes. And to mention just 3 ways, we must foster our soils in a way that increases the amount of carbon they store. We must use agroforestry, produce more standing carbon in our agricultural land. And on the more technological side, I think there's some really interesting things we can do to prevent livestock producing as much methane. We're going to have hard decisions on the demand side. We're going to have to eat less food of the type that produces the most carbon dioxide and emissions. And I think we may be talking a bit more about that later on. And then we must reduce waste, and waste is really important, but don't believe it's a magic bullet. Some of the waste is actually economically understandable. And then there are whole technological and institutional economic issues around the governance of the food system. And unless we do these things simultaneously and at scale and at speed, there is no way we're going to get into net zero, and there's no way that we're going to meet 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. Thank you.
Thank you. And you mentioned we have to do more with less, basically. And so, Jonathan, what about the equity considerations then in terms of land use?
Thank you, Carolyn. If we were given the planet and its potential agricultural lands and the people who were involved in farming, and we knew we had to feed everybody, I don't think for a moment we would design land use as it is at present, if we were able to start afresh. Perhaps we could think of the tropics, but going to a slightly different aspect from the one Susanna mentioned, without naming particular countries, I'm sure you're all aware of places where a lot of the best lands are in extensive pasture land, and the people who produce a lot of the basic foodstuffs, the grains for themselves and others, are on the difficult sloping lands, which would not be the preferred ones for those crops. And we don't just have to look at developing countries. What would we say about family farms in some developed countries in this continent, perhaps in the Americas, where sustainable productive family units that were producing a range of foodstuffs, feeding themselves and others, have tended to go over to large monocultures with just one type of crop being grown, with all that that implies, not just for the biodiversity and the sustainability, but actually for people and how they live on that land. And so our systems that are moving in ways that just seem to be working against the people, as well as against the possibility of sustainable production. This is partly, it seems to me, a result of us believing that efficiency comes from large fields, focused production, better economics. But I've been fortunate to work in places such as, for example, some of the highlands of Colombia, where family farms produce maize and beans in beautiful mixed systems and live quite a prosperous small farm life. I'm not saying that that's for everybody, but that certainly is an image of how farming can be in terms of production and in terms of well-being of the people doing the farming and in terms of the quality of the foodstuffs and the range of foodstuffs produced. That doesn't for a moment suggest that people involved in small-scale farming or people involved in mixed cropping of different crops are in any way inferior or poor compared to some of what we might regard as, quote, modern agriculture. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jonathan. But perhaps there are some other resource implications as well, in addition to all that you have mentioned, issues such as fresh water. So Hans, what do you see as some of the other resource implications?
First of all, I think in general, I clearly follow my colleagues here with their analysis. There's no doubt that we have jeopardized through the production systems over decades natural resources in a way by using too much of inputs, may it be fertilizer, may it be chemical products, having now residues, pollution in water, or residues in food, and definitely this we do not want to continue. And yes, water, it has been said, I mean, water is absolutely the most important element, but only with water we can also not survive. That means, in fact, agriculture and water is a so much critical topic, as said also in tropical forests, as I have a little bit of an experience in this kind of agricultural systems, as I have been in Brazil for many years. For me, water and climate change and the water circulation is extremely important to understand, and we are not taking care too much also in science about understanding water circulations and just always being hooked just on one molecule, and this is CO2. But going back, to resource implications, now we have talking about natural resources, we have talking about eventually technologies, not yet so much about technologies, but the most important resource we do have on that planet, and unfortunately people do not talk about it, is the farmers themselves. Be aware that whatever we're going to do now here and talk at very high level, if we are not able to drill that down, to make sure that out of that big cloud, the drop is really arriving at the ground, and we have really individuals that are there with the capacity, with the capabilities, and understanding why they have to change. And that is mainly a question of their heart and their head. That is the only way to make a twist and then to change production systems. It's not about governance. It's not about politics today. And it's also not only just pointing out to, it's the private sector or it's the public sector. No, it's about really looking into what can we all do to make that twist and to change, because the only ones who are the stewards of many things like water, like land use, the stewards of nature are farmers. And here comes the next one, you know. Now, if we want them to change, we also have to tell them why they should change and why they should go there, because as many of you may know that we have an overaging agriculture population. And why? Because younger generations do not see any future in agriculture anymore. So my question mainly to the friends from FAO was always, you know, you tell me we have to produce more, but I'm going to tell you back, and asking, who is going to do the job? And then there was radio silence. We don't know who is going to do the job. So keep that in mind. If we're talking about rather resources, human beings, people who are out there in rural areas, farmers, young people, to make sure that we keep talented young people in this wonderful profession, to make sure that we all here in urban centers have enough food, good food, and quality food available at affordable prices for everybody.
Thank you very much, Hans. And that's a good way of ending the first part of the session. Keep your questions. We will have a time for you to ask your questions. The most important resource are farmers. And so, but Jonathan, you would like to make a point.
Yes, Carolyn, thank you. I think you mentioned it in your opening comments, but the statistic may have slipped away. If we look at land use today, about 3/4 of the land is being used for animal production. Quite apart from the equity issues, it's a pretty inefficient way of using our land. And something like 35% of the crops that are produced are fed to animals. And even some of the crops that could be eaten are used for biofuel production. And I won't go into some of the policies that have existed even in Europe that have tended to stimulate the use of food crops for producing biofuels instead of going to products that could be converted and are not food products. So we, not only for equity reasons, but just in terms of the right way to use our land, we have to think seriously about how much meat we're eating. And that doesn't mean that those in, shall we say, in Africa who eat so little meat in their diet and depend on extensive animal farming in very dry areas should be eating less meat. Actually means that if we care about greenhouse gases and responsible food production for everybody in the world, maybe we need to be thinking about how much meat we eat.
Thank you. Go ahead, Tim.
Following along on that, and because we maybe focused a bit on production, and that's turning in a bit more towards consumption, we do need to realize that although the population's growing and all of these effects are coming from this, that there's a tremendous question of future justice to these generations of people who are coming along. There's no particular reason that the denial should come from them alone, and that we shouldn't be trying to do this. As with so many of these global problems, we do have to recognize that there is some entitlement to growth in places. Almost all of the population growth in the next century is going to come in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, according to most, certainly according to UN forecasts, whereas the population growth in most of the rest of the world is in precipitous decline. So we need to be able to deal with that, and we need to be able to deal with production in a way to try to make sure that it's a fair deal in terms of what these future generations will receive.
Thank you, Tim, for making that point, that it's not just an issue of population, it's also an issue of consumption. And how do we balance off the two? And so as we move to the food security issues and going deeper into these production possibilities, how can we increase the resource efficiency of production? I'll probably ask Charles, how do we reduce inefficiencies in, let's say, water and chemical and energy use, for example?
Thanks, Carolyn. So let me say a little bit about the technological things one can do and then move on briefly to humans. So many of you will have heard the term precision agriculture. So today, using modern techniques, using data, using information science, using modern tractors, which look to me a bit like the inside of the Starship Enterprise, one can do, at least in the rich world, one can apply fertilizers, pesticides, in a much more efficient way that was possible in the past. And I think we will see in the next 10 or 20 years some really exciting things happening in terms of agricultural efficiency. I think that it's wrong to think about precision agriculture purely as a rich world, as a rich world phenomena. One can do things in much poorer countries to increase the efficiency of use. My colleague in the UK, Gordon Conway, has a wonderful slide called Precision Agriculture, which has one of these modern tractors on one side, and the other half has a cap of a bottle of Coca-Cola. And if you provide people, A, with a small amount of capital they need, that they can go out and buy fertilizer, and then with the human capital to know that if you fill up just that simple cap of a Coke bottle and put it at the base of your corn plant, at the base of your maize plant, you can have a 50 or 60% increase. So again, I very much resonate with what Hans was saying about the importance of human capital, about the importance of being farmer-centric all the way along. So there's a lot one can do with precision agriculture. We talked about water. We tend to waste water in the most extraordinary way. There's a really good economic theory of how one can price water. And to a large extent, it's not applied where it should be. And of course, the answer for that, as the modern economists will say, is it's not just the economics, it's a political economy, it's the institutional economy. And we need to be really much more smarter on that. So we have to use fertilizer if we have any hope of feeding 10 billion people, but we want to use it efficiently. And we want to produce fertilizer in a way that has much less greenhouse gas emissions. So the Haber-Bosch process that was invented a little over 100 years ago, not that far from here actually, because it is so efficient, there's been relatively little research on it over the last 50 or 60 years. We need to refocus our research, so it's not purely on increasing yields. Increasing yields is important, but increasing efficiency all the way along. And I want to come back to human capital and the importance of working with farmers. And there are some really hard discussions and decisions that we have to make. So where I work in parts of Africa, and you look at the people who are trying to till the land there, in economic jargon, their total factor productivity is just terrible. They cannot produce enough income in order to support the people who have to live on that land. And my colleagues here with a greater knowledge of history will be able to tell you in greater detail about how we in the rich world and how we've seen it happen in Asia in the last 20 or 30 years have been able to transform agriculture, and in particular to make farmers have decent livings from their land. And again, Hans, I do completely agree with never forget the farmers. In Europe, we did it by bringing people off the land into factories and to exporting 60 million of them to new continents. There are no new continents. As Richard Baldwin here in particular, in his wonderful books about globalization, has shown in East Asia, Asia was able to do this again by sucking people off the land. I really worry about what will happen in sub-Saharan Africa, where, as Tim said, it's really the only large part of the world where population growth is still running 5 or 6%. And to me, that is the absolute research priority of organizations such as the Geneva Institute, my organization in Oxford as well. It's a really exciting and important time to be thinking about these development issues and the interaction of agriculture with the whole of sustainable development.
Thank you. Suzanne, yeah?
One of the things I would mention about reducing population is giving, and there's tons of research on this, is giving women education and educating girls and also giving women control over their reproductive rights. In this sense, what happens is that women tend to not have so many children. What that means, though, is that you also end up not having tons of child labor that you can devote to agriculture, which means that you require a kind of intensification. The other thing I would like to mention, too, is that we need to really be looking much more carefully at indigenous knowledge systems in this dynamic, particularly in the tropics, because the monoculture systems for the tropics are not working out very well. They're quite unstable. They remain unstable over time. I began my career in cattle ranching in Amazonia, and I'm rather dismayed that, 30 years later, the average productivity per hectare is still 1 animal unit per hectare in most contexts. So the problem is perhaps that we need to be looking not just at transforming these systems into monocultures that we can read very clearly, because that's what we are accustomed to looking at, but really focusing a lot more on the complex knowledge of how to manage multi-strata systems that, as agroecologists call it, overyield. We don't just measure one thing. You measure several things, and also the value of the environmental services that are produced at the same time. Carbon absorption, water management, and improved soil aspects, including soil carbon storage.
Thank you, Susan, for bringing the education part in. Some of you might know that when it comes to women receiving extension services, for example, only 15% goes to women. And so, Hans, you might want to tell us, how do we improve the efficiencies for local farmers, including extension services?
Yes, I may quickly go back to Brazil, because that's about 40 years ago. I was, as a young deputy farm manager, acting on such a farm where we had 1 cattle, 1 head per hectare. And you're absolutely right, and I was the one who said, and started as a young economist, to make all the kind of calculations and looking at the soil and looking at the pastures, and it never fits. So I went and I said, look, guys, we're losing money, and this was all tax money because, that was this kind of Nova Fronteira Agrícola, they call it at that time, and that is where I was fired, okay? And they are still there.
Incentives.
And helpfully, I was fired because I was then doing other things. But that means that we are still practicing production system agriculture that has no future in many parts of the world. So we have to be much keener to understand how to use the different lands and the different soils. And that has to go, first of all, with understanding also what can be done and mapping out with research institutes what is the best way to use. And going back to Africa, there's another one also. Africa is absolutely in the situation where we have difficulties to get more productivity out there, but there are pockets of hope. And in my company, we had said already 15 years ago, we want to source as much as possible locally in Africa, because it was so difficult to bring in raw materials, quality issues, exchange rate fluctuations, and all these kinds of things, no stability, and we are now at 85% of all the raw materials that are being used in the products are locally sourced. And this is called Farmer Connect, and that is where we have learned, and we have massively invested into training people. So I take you to Nigeria. Nigeria, where we are working with about 30,000 smallholder farmers to produce raw materials to produce these famous Maggi cubes. Now, out of these 30,000 farmers, there are now about 300, 400 community leaders who became really agripreneurs. And these agripreneurs, agricultural entrepreneurs, they are having now a good living standard, and they have an income where, in fact, they outperform many of their peers. And that is the way how to maintain, again, young people in agriculture. And that has a great thing to do also with using now technologies. It's not exactly the same technologies as we use it in the United States or here, but you have also to come in areas where you have difficulties to provide young people with new technologies. And I think that is extremely important, that we help to train, to use these technologies. We get them access to these technologies, and then we make sure that they have access to markets, and by that you start to have a kind of a cash flow to rural areas. And that is the only way to have a success, to maintain and to keep people, young people again, in rural areas, and at the same time also having locally sourced materials. So this kind of activities that goes hand in hand by demanding what you need for your products, but at the other hand also, going back maybe just a last one on productivity, what we see is that there's a tremendous potential also on productivity gains, and this is just about good agricultural practices. You know, all of you, you went to universities, to colleges, to whatever, you're practitioners. These people out there, they have never been to what we call here an apprenticeship program. They have never learned really a job. We say they are farmers, but in fact they are not farmers as we think farmers do their job here in Switzerland, for instance. Here, to be a farmer, you need to go at least to 3 or 4 years of a training program. So if you start with 3 months or 4 months or 6 months or a continuous training program, immediately these people out there in Africa, they are producing not 20, 30, 40% more. They're producing 3 times more. And that is where I have said this is this pockets of hope that is out there. And you can do that, but you can only do that together. And you can only do that if you give them access to markets and if you pay them the right and the fair price.
Okay, thank you. Charles, you wanted to add to that, and then we'll come to Jonathan.
I was just going to come in here with another pocket of hope, because I think it's so important. It's easy to fall in the trap of saying everything in Africa is bad and getting worse. And as Hans says, there are real pockets of hope there, especially where there are crops which are sort of vertically integrated, and companies like Nestle can get involved. And I think, as Hans said, one of the most important points is that that type of agriculture is bringing money into the rural economy. And the other pocket of hope I was going to talk about is in some countries, and particularly mention Ethiopia, where the government has engineered really a very major increase in productivity and a boost to the rural economy by doing some quite sensible things, like making certain that each small town out in the rural area has a bank with a bank manager who gets to know who the farmers are, who can make sensible investments in this farm and not that farm, and can begin to bring some capital into the rural community, which in combination with the skills that Hans was talking can begin to increase productivity. And we've seen this in Ethiopia and a couple of other countries, but in many other parts of Africa this hasn't happened. And again, there's some really interesting social and political economy issues about why it happens in some places but not others.
Thank you, Charles. Indeed, Africa is a big continent, 53 countries, so it will be a little bit presumptuous to make assumptions, generalized assumptions. But Hans, you mentioned quite a bit about local farmers, and that while they have not been probably to formal educational institutions, that they have a big contribution to make. And perhaps, Jonathan, you want to talk about the contributions of local communities to global agriculture.
Yes, thank you, Carolyn. I was just starting to shift a little bit in my seat there. I do hear a certain northern projection into the south. So I think it's been shown in many cases that the reasons some small-scale farmers in particular in poor areas don't adopt certain types of technology, not because they don't know about it, but because actually they're better economists than people like me who say, hey, why don't you try this or why don't you try that? They're better economists because they know what their their limits are in terms of things such as risk of investment, in terms of risks of variability of climate. If you're a subsistence farmer, or even if you're producing for the market, and you have one bad year, that can sink you. And we have to be a little bit careful then, I think, in understanding why people do what they do. Is it really lack of knowledge, and do we have to come in and put things right? I'd prefer to see it in a slightly different way, that small-scale farmers in particular, who've been living on marginal lands for the reasons we mentioned before, are actually extraordinary experts in making the best of those conditions. And as pressures in our world, particularly climate change, are going to change the nature of agricultural production in just about everywhere we live, I see that as those small-scale farmers as a resource in terms of knowledge. Now, I don't want to say that they have the knowledge and their knowledge alone is going to save us all. No, I think it's a question of looking for a synthesis of traditional knowledge and knowledge that's been built up over those tough conditions with what can come from, what shall I call it, modern science, the sort of things that my colleagues have already mentioned. Let us be careful there then, because those farming systems can be really sophisticated in terms of how they're producing under the circumstances they have. What is efficiency? In the north, we tend to think of production per hectare. We're starting, even in the north, to think about production per unit of costly inputs. I think we're just about beginning to think about production in terms of unit of greenhouse gas produced. And certainly, small-scale farmers have always been looking at things such as production per unit of labor, which can be very limiting in some small farm conditions. So let us please always go and look at those conditions with an eye to respecting the people who may have a different education from ours, but actually may often be experts in the place they're working.
Thank you. And Susan, as you add to that, perhaps you may also want to speak a little bit about the mitigation of an adaptation to climate change in this context.
Yes, well, when I hear mitigation questions, I always say trees have already been invented. So while we're waiting for that great machine that sucks carbon out of the air and produces diamonds for us, we can still wait for that and still hope for that. But in the meantime, what we can do and what we should be doing in many areas of the tropics is engaging in forest recovery of various kinds. Forests and tree planting of various kinds. Again, what this does is it not only sucks up carbon, but also has a lot of additionality in terms of species habitats and also livelihood inputs, as well as its carbon dynamics. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind with all of this is that when we're talking about small farmers here, we have this idea that they're all growing grains. Again, I want to emphasize that in forested areas, these areas have been in production. A lot of what we think of as wild forests are essentially anthropogenic forests. They have many new kinds of crops that could be used in new farming systems. I often say, how many people here eat acai? I do, but my students all raise their hands, but perhaps it's not so popular here. But the point is that it has become a multi-billion-dollar crop. It wasn't widely in global circulation. It's grown largely by small farmers in Amazonian estuaries. And it's grown in complex ecosystems. And there are many other systems like that. Oh, I'm supposed to use the microphone. Yes, thank you. Sorry, I forgot. But the point that I really want to make is that there are many kinds of forest platforms that can be used. There are many kinds of crops that are grown in these areas that can become part of an alternative system that keeps forest up and helps land recuperate. The other thing, though, is that these tend not to be corn and beans, but rather what we might think of as niche crops of many kinds. Well, the Swiss, of course, love chocolate, and me too. But things like acai, coffee, many kinds of palm fruits that are eaten, not eaten by your car or used for shampoo, are important elements of this. The point is also that most of the research on sustainability and in farming systems hasn't gone into tree crops. It's gone mostly into the agro-industrial crops, and as a result, what we have is a kind of a knowledge vacuum. And this is going to become more important as we engage with, as we're vulnerable to climate change, to keep trees up as a means of buffering parts of climate change insofar as this is possible at medium scales. So my main point here is that really we need to be looking at negative emission technologies, and the best ones we have so far, both for mitigation and adaptation, are trees. And they work at multiple scales. They aren't costly to integrate into farming systems, and they have been integrated into farming systems for millennia.
Thank you, Susanna. We have quite a bit of ground to cover to try to beat to the consumption possibilities. And Hans, I will come to you just now on agriculture yield expansion. But perhaps, Tim, you could speak first on the yield expansion independent of land use, so the diffusion of technologies.
Well, it is a nice time, given the amount of discussion we've had here about sort of the micro of farm development and of farming, especially in developing countries. Now, and the importance of finance and the importance of local knowledge, and all of this is important. But I think that the important thing at this big picture scale is, well, how are we going to deal with this force of moving from 7 to 10 billion people and still try to keep some land aside for other uses? And that's going to have to require that we manage to try to create some different sorts of agricultural systems that don't just expand along linearly with the size of the population expansion. Now, I think the interesting thing to say about that question is that the experiment's already been tried, and in the last 50 years, essentially in 1960, the developing and the developed world had the same amount of land in agriculture. That was about 700 million hectares apiece in the two parts of the world. And in the last 50 years, the amount in the developed world has actually fallen down towards 600 million hectares, and the amount of land used in agriculture in the developing world has increased 50%. So even though we talk about in terms of global averages, the two parts of the world have been going in opposite directions in terms of land use. And if you run production function analysis that essentially tries to see how it is that agriculture works, land turns out to be one of the least important ingredients in making agriculture. It's important for many other things, cultural and knowledge generation, all kinds of issues. But I think that the experiment that we've run in the last 50 years is an indication of what we're going to have to solve in the next 50, which is going to be how is it that we can try to incorporate other parts of the world other than the ones that have been used into land-sparing approaches to agriculture. Whatever those policies might be. I don't think it necessarily means that it has to be the exact same development track that was followed in the developed world, but it means that some approach that will try to generate the same outcome should be possible and will have to be attempted.
Thank you, Tim. Hans, you want to add to that? In terms of
Yes, but I would like to go back to the acai story, you know? Who knows acai? Who has ever experienced acai juice? Yes. And acai palm heart? Less. It's the same plant, okay? And what I wanted to say with that is that if you take the heart out, the tree is done. You don't get the juice. And that is an interesting thing, you know. So here, acai, cupuaçu, moringa, and all those things, these are so-called superfoods, yes? Who is in superfoods? Not so many, only a few. But you know, this goes back to biodiversity. And this goes back to see, like in Brazil, in acai, this is not big plantations. If you want to be in superfoods, you have to work, and that is an outstanding opportunity for smallholder farming. The industry, the food industry, is going at the galloping stage into the superfoods. You see that everywhere. Haven't you seen that even here in Switzerland, in Migros, in all these big shops? And yes? Who has gone into superfoods? Not so much. But what I wanted to say is that, look, those who are going to eat superfoods, they already eat a little bit less of animal protein, for sure. And that has a tremendous impact on land use and on the issue on who you can now put back, you know, to get an income stream on these superfoods. And that has a great deal more to do with the new production systems for the future to look at, because you as consumers are going to ask for, rather than really impacting, you know, from policies and laws and all these kind of things, or money for farmers to give, you know, I think you have a tremendous decision power to have an impact on how farmers are doing their job for the future by demanding differentiated raw materials. And you may also know that we are more or less only on about 10, 12, or 15 species feeding 80% of population. And I think if we are going to open up to diverse this diet, having a better diet diversity, this will have a tremendous impact on many things on that planet. And therefore, I'm not too much into looking into only, you know, what can we do with more genetics, having more kgs per hectare of maize or wheat or this. This will come anyhow. We have that, and there is a tremendous potential still to produce much more on what we have on the land. Just to give me the last sentence about this kind of things, today, we know that you can have, for instance, in cocoa, you all eat chocolate, don't you? Yes? Okay, so cocoa is very important, well, because, you know, we say 10 people you ask, 9 say, yes, I like really chocolate, yeah? And the 10th is normally lying, you know? But anyhow, so we know how important it is really to have good chocolate products for you prepared. But we also know the misery many of these cocoa farmers are living. And we know that with the technologies we have today, we can have up to 3 to 4 tons, 4,000 kgs per hectare of cocoa produced versus 300 or 400 or less kgs per hectare. So you can today literally give back to nature 9 out of 10 hectares, and with the 1 hectare, and that is not super technology to use, you generate an income, a living income for a smallholder farmer. So the technologies is out there, but you have to train, once again, these people, and we have already many thousand people trained on that, and we will see the impact in 3, 4, 5 years, because it takes at least 5 years to really make that transformation. So there is, again, a tremendous opportunity and the potential there to make much better things happening, but you can only do it, not with PowerPoint presentations, you can only do it having the farmers with you and really impacting this community.
Thank you, Hans. I can see you're very passionate about this, but I'm going to be fired for my time management. So let us just turn now to, it was mentioned before, but the consumption possibilities. And I'll ask Jonathan to speak here because we need to drastically shift and improve the food supply chain. So Jonathan, you probably want to talk a little bit about investing in farmers and farming communities.
Yes, thank you, Carolyn. So I touched already on the reasons why, speaking first of small farmers, why they may not be doing things that seem obvious. And to take the other side of the coin, we know that if there are things such as crop insurance available for small farmers, if there are ways of handling that year that fails, and if with our great ideas about really high value crops, we are sure that we can continue to offer the purchase of those crops that are really interesting to farmers to grow. I'm afraid history is rather full of examples of particularly small-scale farmers, and often in the South, but not only, being induced to grow more of a new high-value crop, and then production increases in different parts of the world and the bottom falls out of the market. How do you manage those farmers who have invested in something, change their farming system, and then they no longer have something that's profitable? So there's something there about ensuring that small farmers' production continues balanced, range of crops for the nutrition reasons for them and the people they supply, but also just in terms of having something that's resilient in the future. And although I'm speaking there of small-scale farmers, I think since I've been asked about farming communities in general, let's talk about large-scale farmers. I think whether we're speaking of developed or developing countries, there's a huge opportunity for more encouragement and investment of people who have more land, but to grow their crops in a more sustainable, a more responsible way in terms of environment and of climate change. And you can see in different parts of the world that's just beginning to take root. So we don't have to automatically think that large-scale agriculture means a lot of purchased inputs and a lot of greenhouse gases.
Thank you. Charles, you spoke earlier, you mentioned, I think, in passing about the human direct consumption of foods grown for animals. And so you may want to expand on that at this point.
Well, I mentioned that certainly with greenhouse. Thank you.
Yes, we do the same thing.
Thank you, Jonathan. I mentioned that if we're serious about net zero agriculture, then especially in the rich world, we have to eat less meat. And actually, Jonathan made many of the arguments there. But one thing I want to emphasize that Jonathan said is that if we're talking about reducing our meat consumption in the rich world, we shouldn't try and transpose that, especially on communities in the arid areas who absolutely rely on animals. Now, of course, if you're an economist, then an economist will say, well, why we worry about consuming animals in the rich world is largely because of the environmental externalities, some health externalities as well. And so an obvious thing to do would be to incorporate them, internalize them in the jargon, and that would mean the price of meat going up. And that makes a lot of sense. What worries me about that is I suspect most of us in this audience have a decent salary, and if we really like meat, we could sort of still afford it if we wanted to, if it's twice the price. But the poorest decile, the poorest 2 deciles in society, is it right that we price meat for environmental reasons and then are denying it to people on low incomes? And so that really worries me about that potential solution. And one potential way around that, and I'm not saying it's a magic bullet, but it's something that's worth investigating, is alternative proteins. And alternative proteins are getting a huge amount of attention at the moment, some hype, but some real interesting investigation. And certainly at the moment, we're beginning to see plant-based proteins, which, when it comes to sort of textured meat, patties, meatballs, hamburgers, things like that, are beginning to get sort of almost indistinguishable in blind tasting from real meat. And I think over the next 10 or 20 years, we're going to see new technologies coming in, some from insects, some from fungi, mycoproteins, possibly algae. And my guess, 10, 20 years down the line, lab-based meat, cultured meat. We can see that the intellectual progress there is more likely to come from areas such as wound healing in medicine, and then is going to provide ways of growing muscles in the laboratory. So I don't personally know myself whether this is part of the solution. I suspect it might be, but it's certainly one of the most interesting things happening in the food system at the moment. They're really, I'm always a bit suspicious of people using the word disruption, but there really might be disruption in the food system around proteins in the next couple of decades.
If I can just make a little ethnographic remark here, in Latin America, of course, in Central America, they've been eating these little chipolines, these little grasshoppers forever, and they're delicious. In Amazonia, the palm grubs are, you can go to any market in the upper Amazon, and on a grill, you'll see the little sputtering last little grubs, and they're absolutely delicious. And these are easily, they taste wonderful, they're highly abundant, they are basically a means of also managing your ecosystems for pest control. So it's, and there's a long history and tradition of eating them. So these might be your future acai. The other thing is, and I'm a traditional in this, but, eating nuts is not the world's worst thing. And they consortiate very well, also with pasture, also with crops. So the other thing is that we have a very limited understanding of the potential of tree nuts as an alternative in these kinds of things. We think of walnuts or Brazil nuts, but there are many, many kinds of palm nuts that are extremely delicious and high superfoods in they're extremely important in their antioxidant composition. So we haven't even really explored what the potential is in these tropical ecosystems, and there's a huge amount of ethnobotany on this. It's simply that we just, for structural reasons, end up growing soybean on 50 million acres in Latin America, and globally only 6% of soy is consumed by people, in lieu of looking at the forest itself as a platform for alternative crops, and the crops that, and in this I include grubs and chipolines, that are delicious.
If I could very, very mildly disagree with my colleague, they do taste delicious, but they have to be in a very good sauce first.
Well, it's,
Yeah.
I don't know. That
Perhaps we
crunch.
can. A lot has been said, and I think quite a bit of the what we can do has come out in the discussions. And if the panelists would agree, I'd probably turn to the audience. Before, yes.
Because I think it's important, being the R&D spokesman here, to talk a little bit about the public-private sector roles in this. And I think that one of the big changes that's been occurring, whether or not it's something that many people are aware of or not, is a very large change in the role of the public sector in agriculture, in global agriculture. And I think that before we move off, it's important to bring it out that agriculture, globally or nationally, was always a joint enterprise. And it was done together. It was done through land-grant universities. It was done through government. Sometimes the Department of Agriculture was the first ministry ever established in countries, oftentimes was. And the development of links between universities, between botany departments, this has always been the core of what global agriculture was and has been, and it culminated in the consultative group system, the CG system run through the FAO and the World Bank. And I think it's important to know and to recognize that this system has essentially been in slow decline over the last 10 to 20 years. as this cooperative network, essentially you get slowly starved of resources. And I think that's a very important thing because it's essentially been the way that resources and R&D and agriculture advanced in most countries. And it's important that, especially in a place like Geneva, that everyone is aware that this is something that's been critical and crucial to global agriculture and is currently in a state of significant change. Personally, I think that it's an important step in the right direction to reinvest in the CG system and to try to get that global system of agriculture back in place again.
Thank you. Tim, do you mind if we take a few questions from the audience at this point in time? Given the... yes. Okay, so if you just say your name, perhaps where you're from, and if you have the question directed to a particular panelist, please indicate. Yes. Okay, so maybe we'll, if you do the microphone, this way. Start. And if the questions could be concise so that we can have a lot of them.
May I start? Thank you. I'm Christophe Gironde. I work at the Graduate Institute. I'm a lecturer. And not much or even nothing has been said about land tenure. I think Susanna mentioned the criminalization or decriminalization of laws. And I think the history of agricultural development tells us that without land tenure, you can train people, you can provide them with microcredit, you can provide them with the best technology, they may not go for it. And one of the key trends related to land tenure is what is called land grabbing. If I take the case of Cambodia, where I do field research, it's about 20% of the total arable land that has been transferred as economic land concession to large-scale companies that do produce mostly rubber for the tire industry that is exported to China and Vietnam. And this is not going into the direction that you are thinking about. So I would be happy to hear some of the colleagues.
Thank you, land tenure. Let's take a couple more.
Hello. Thank you very much, panel, for the discussion. I am a graduate from the Institute and I wrote my thesis on food waste. So my question is about food waste. Most likely we talk about food production in agriculture, and how do you think about reducing food waste and loss, especially we do not have yet a concrete idea of the difference between food waste and loss, and we individuals or consumers do not know how we can collaborate with commercials to reduce this problem. And my second question is also about land grabbing. How do you think would be the role of smallholder farmers in agriculture, given large corporates would likely benefit from intensification of agriculture? So where do you see the role of small farmers would be in agriculture?
Thank you.
My name is Jack Ritkin. I'm an engineer. I like what you talk about, but I have a question. You don't speak about the post-harvest loss. This is fabulous big. The post-harvest loss. And I believe this is a very important point where we can make quite a larger profit for the small farmer.
Okay. Thank you. So post-harvest loss. We'll take two more and then we'll come to the panelists.
Yeah, sure. Atlantic market. Yeah.
Oh. Oh, is it me? Sorry, I have the microphone, so I'll take advantage. Jonathan Fowler, I'm the Chief of Communications at the World Meteorological Organization. Obviously, weather information is absolutely critical to get things right. From your perspective, so in your professional sectors, I was wondering if you think that more can be done to get the right kind of weather information to the people that need it.
Okay, thank you. Can I? the last question before we...
Yes, I have the microphone.
Yes, go ahead, madam.
But I can't be seen. Atlanti Moquette from Giving Women. One of the issues we haven't talked at all about is gender. 43% of the women working in subsistence farming are women. We talk about land grabbing. They don't have any rights to land. They are responsible for feeding their families, and yet most of the food that they're growing is not nutritious. So we're having a whole lot of issues around the developmental stages of their children. And I think that we really need to address this as a very important part of food security.
Thank you. We did have the food loss and waste here, but I just wanted to go to you first and then come back. So Hans, you can probably speak about that now.
Yes, in fact, the good news, but the difficult news is about the fact that we could today, with the technologies we have, with the farmers that are out there, with the land that is on the crops or plantations, feed easily 10+ billion on that planet. There's no way that people should suffer from hunger. Now, why can't we do that? There are different reasons, but one of the big reasons is because we're wasting at least 30 to 40% of everything. Now, we start at the beginning, at the farm. Yes, at the farm, you do not really grab into the overall potential of yields. That's the first thing you're missing. And then, as you said, yes, at the farm, you may then have post-harvest losses. In developing countries, on this first part, farm and first transformation stage, you have most of the losses close to 30 or 40%. In so-called advanced or developed nations in the United States or here in Europe, but mainly in the United States, you're losing out with consumers more than 40%, okay? So that's the totally shift. Now, why do we lose out on 40% on consumers? That is my very personal remark. That is because we don't put the real value on food. We don't have the consciousness really to see the value of food. And sometimes it's also definitely too cheap. And why is it possible to serve all these too cheap things? Because we have standardized, as I said, on half a dozen or a little bit more of a dozen of varieties, a food system worldwide that is extremely efficient, that only in nations like here in Switzerland, in many European nations, there are not more than 2, 3, 4% of the economic active population working in agriculture to feed the rest of the 97. So keep that in mind, that agriculture production systems, the way they are run today, are extremely efficient, but yes, provoking everything we have discussed at the beginning of this panel here. Now we see that there are certain things we have to immediately correct.
Okay, thank you. Who's going to take the land tenure, Tim, you want to? The land tenure, land grabbing?
That was a hand for land grab.
Okay, so you...
will just speak to land grabs for a moment. Probably somebody will have something else to add, because I think it's symptomatic of the same thing I was saying, and it's a failure to invest in the countries concerned. So if you don't invest, then another way to try to capture the value of improving the local lands is to simply take the lands and then do the investment. In the past, instead, the idea was to create investments in the human capital, in the social capital, and the educational capital of the country concerned, and to let them develop their own lands. And with the collapse of those policies, I think that it's made the decision to move in and take over to be something that was unavoidable. So I think that it's a back side of that same problem of failure to invest in these countries and their agriculture, and that's been happening over the last 20 years.
I'll just add quickly to that. I think that the other thing is that We have a dynamic, which is a historical dynamic, that the way that you capture land is by clearing it. And so one of the dynamics that's associated with this transfer is not just that somehow one is not investing, it's that one is actually de-investing in the environmental services that these areas are providing, and also in the alternative land uses that are potentially able to do this. The other thing I would say is that we have sort of a benign view of what's going on here too in the agricultural sector. There's a great deal of deforestation and land development for reasons of money laundering. There is a great deal of fraudulent capture and resale, so that this is also an area of a lot of speculation. That is, land is not just an input into production, it's a vehicle often for capturing fiscal incentives, for corrupt practices, and this kind of thing. In that, the other thing I would also like to say is that in the current climate, one of the things that one sees is that in conservation areas, if you convert them to, if you deforest them and burn them and throw a little pasture grass on it, essentially it's a sort of de facto de-gazetting of protected areas, because what's argued for transferring that land to the clearer is that the environmental virtues of that land as a forested stand are gone. So why not just hand the title over? So this has also been an extraordinary stimulus in the dynamic of forest conversion in the last 2 or 3 years.
Charles?
A few years back, a group from Oxford did an analysis of major investments, sort of land grabs in developing countries, and the sad truth was, in nearly all cases, the local populations had come out really badly from it. There were a couple of cases which were genuine win-wins, and they largely founded just on institutional issues in the country. I want to briefly, just to follow up on Jonathan's point about modern weather forecasting. And there's some really exciting things that are going on, and I think India is one of the countries where this is most advanced. So the advances that have happened, both theoretically and actually in raw computing power, in medium-term weather forecasting, coupled with novel financial instruments such as index insurance, I think are doing a real good for some of the really important issues Jonathan raised about insurance for crop failure. And I want to say one brief thing about post-harvest loss to follow up on some of the comments that are made already. And this is an area where it really does, especially in developing countries, need more research. There are some interesting trade-offs there. We know that one could reduce post-harvest loss by investing in cold chain, in cold storage in the food chain. And there is an interesting trade-off between greenhouse gas emissions from cold storage and greenhouse gas savings from less food waste. And again, these has to be looked at in the round so that one can get overall benefits. If one does it badly, one can cure one problem but make another one worse.
Anybody want to respond to the gender question?
I'll make a few points. One thing I think that one has to look at in these kinds of rural communities also is that they're not full-time rural communities, that they do circular migration, that they're much more mobile than we normally think about. So one of the things is that labor opportunities may very much differ for men and women in urban and rural areas, and we need to be cognizant of that. But the other thing is the real problem of women's rights to land and the durable part of women's rights to land, particularly in collective landed situations, which are both more vulnerable to land grabs and also where gender hierarchies often work really strongly against women's long-term control of land once people begin to migrate away. So there are a lot of things that need to be done on this. what we also see in Latin America is what we call the feminization of the campo, which is that women stay on the land while the husbands migrate to the United States or wherever they're going to migrate to. And the consequence of that is that actually there has been some empowerment over land use decisions, and a lot of them move in away from these monocropping systems into tree crops because of the lower labor demand and the non-necessity of I have to harvest this right now because this rice has to be harvested now, but rather with tree crops you have more play. So the real question that we can see there is a certain amount of empowerment, but the fundamental problem is the traditional issues about women's rights to land and women's control over land. And that can be somewhat addressed at the level of the state, but also within these communities, it really has to be taken on as a community development set of questions rather than simply, a fiat. The other thing, and then I'll shut up, is that in the Brazilian case, you have the rural cadastral areas of rural cadastral de áreas rurais, no? And the thing about that is you need a computer to input where your land is. So you basically geoposition your land, and then it's a step toward actually getting the rights to it. So in this, there's also a technology question and a differential in women's access to the kinds of technologies that would permit them to go into the first process of claiming land that they actually use, even though under Brazilian law, it's not a gendered law, but in terms of being able to claim land that you have used through usucapião, but rather that you don't have the technology through which you can claim it, and then somebody else who does have the technology can incorporate your land in their land, and they have the geospatial
So equal
location.
access to technologies by both men and,
Yeah,
women is something
exactly
we have
so.
to look at. But maybe we can just take one more round of questions. Yes, there's one at the back and two at the back. Yes.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Marie-Hélène Kiprianou. I work with the World Food Programme here in Geneva. Thanks very much. It's a very interesting panel. I would like to take the conversation a bit more at the macro level and ask you what is the responsibility and the reforms that potentially international financial institutions should be doing for the future of food security? Thank you. Like the World Bank or IMF or even the UN. What should be doing to contribute to the future of food security? Thank you.
Next question. I think just in front of.
Hello, my name is Amalia. I'm in marketing. I have a question around can permaculture on a more extensive scale be a solution? And what about urban farming that is developing, on the rooftops of Paris and everywhere? Can this be part of the solution or a consequent solution according to you?
Thank you. We take over this way.
Thank you. My question is, how do you expect food security, or I should say food insecurity, to affect the migration of human populations now and in the future?
Hi, my name is Deandra. I want to ask a question about the rights of farmers, because throughout the panel we have spoken about how it's basically putting the responsibilities on only farmers. But throughout history we have seen that privatization and big companies have had tremendous control over what farmers plant. They have rights over the seeds, and farmers are unable to basically decide and diversify the products that they plant. And if they decide to choose another seed or something like that, they're in trouble. So if we are going into the section of precision agriculture, what rights would farmers have if we switch modes of production and and switch the way how what incentives will they have?
Thank you. And the last question.
Hi, my name is Jared. I'm an alumni from the Institute. Maybe that's perhaps a good question to end with. We've heard a lot of the problems, a lot of the solutions. Potentially from a problem-solving perspective, you have a room here full of people who could solve some of these problems in food security. So maybe each of you could leave us what you think is the biggest ticket, the biggest problem that could be solved. And of course, in the context of a institute that's focused on policy and economics.
Thank you. So maybe we'll come down the line. Tim, you want to go first with any of these questions?
Okay. You saved the big ones for last. There are some of the very big ones. Farmers' rights, I'll turn to that one. I think that, again, it has to do with the questions of how do we make sure that agricultural research can remain seamless, and that we manage to be able to allow the people who do agriculture to be able to work with their own seeds and their own products and to do this. Now, this is captured amongst those of us who do the analytics of this in the discussion about yield gaps, which sounds dull, but it just means the difference between the average production with regards to land in developing countries and developed countries. These yield gaps, which is what investment in diffusion of research are meant to close to help Tanzania have the same production as Kansas, remain stubbornly wide if we don't have those investments. And those investments in the end have to be in farmers, and they have to be in farmers who use their own products to make better seeds and make better products. And that system has been breaking down over the last 10 to 20 years. It's called farmers' rights, but in general, it's a discussion about who can do research and development, who can develop their own agriculture. And it's important that that structure, which was agreed at the UN level, is once again fostered and encouraged at this level of trying to encourage those yield gaps to close. That research should be something that's not just about advancing at the frontier, but about closing from the rear. So that's, again, part of that appeal to try to make sure that that former system of investment at all levels goes on and continues.
I'll try first urban farming. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you for bringing it up. Have a look at the case of Cuba. Huge production within the cities, but beyond that, a way to keep kids, future generations, connected with where our food comes from. It isn't from supermarkets, and the possibility of that more local urban farming in terms of nutritious products. Migration and farming, the place I work crosses some of these areas. A fascinating study done a number of years ago showing that it's difficult to say in a particular situation there's one trigger that caused people to migrate. But if you add things including perhaps local violence, climate change and effect on the natural farming resources, and even things that might sound mundane like changes in local subsidy policies for inputs or of the purchase price of products and so on. And so the combination of those things can trigger the migration. And I must also say that remember that 90+% of migration is still within countries, usually in the south, and another significant part is from one southern country to another, and very, very little migration is still between south and north, even though that's not the impression we might get from listening to some sources. And on the thing we need, difficult, I would echo what Tim was saying and tweak it a little bit. I think we need governments to take back control in terms of the playing field, the rules of the game in food production. I think to expect the market to deal with all these things, whether we're talking about the right to use land, or whether we're talking about the way seeds are distributed and things that seem very technical and mundane, and there could be a whole other list. I think we need to see more governance of how food is produced, because after all, it's the #1 importance for populations, and it will get much more difficult to handle that as climate change increases.
Okay, I'll take on permaculture. Agroforestry systems are permaculture systems par excellence. There are some excellent examples of permaculture experiments that show that these are viable systems over time, but they're very unconventional. But the other thing that's important about them is that they are quite efficient in their use of inputs, and also have, as they say, lots of additionalities. Within these kinds of permaculture systems, though, because they provide habitats for things like bees and other kinds of pollinators, they can really counteract at the local level what we see are problems of ecosystem decline and collapse linked to loss of things like pollinators. And this is actually, and it has an interesting tie-in with urban farming, where honeybee dieback doesn't seem to occur, simply because, although it doesn't seem like it, urban areas are far less toxic to insects than farming systems. For my rural farming systems based on monocultures. So finally, for me, one of the key issues, of course, revolving around climate change is that issue of trees have already been invented. These are our predominant negative emissions technology that can be deployed tomorrow. You can all go out and plant some trees. And also the thing is that they don't have entry barriers in the same way that other technologies do. And they can be highly productive with lots of different kinds of additionality. Yes, I understand you can't grow trees everywhere, and not everywhere is appropriate to do various kinds of agroforestry, but we could be doing a lot more of it.
I'm going to try and probably fail to hit simultaneously finance, migration, and Gerard's plea for job creation for alumni of the Graduate Institute of Geneva. I think the thing that keeps me awake at night on food security in the medium term, the next 10 years or 15 years or so, is what if we got it wrong with some of the enormous megacities of the global south, the Kinshasas, the Lagos. These are cities that now have 10 to 20 million people living in them. And at the moment, they are in large part fed from global commodity trade. Now, in the future, we will hope that much more of the food is produced locally. But in the short to medium term, the global commodity system has to provide those foods for those people. Now, much of that is in the private sector, and I think in large part does an extraordinarily good job of very efficiently distributing food from areas of food surplus to areas of food need. But I guess what I would like to be reassured with, that this is a system that could cope with a series of disruptions that were bigger than happened in 2008. In 2008, relatively minor disruptions caused tremendous volatility in the global food system, and it could be much worse than that. So I think the really smart economists here and the people who understand trade and things is just to ensure that we have the resilience in the global food system that isn't going to see horrible things happening in these big conurbations. And you know, we see tragedies played out on our television screens of migration, what's happening in the across the Mediterranean. And Jonathan, you're completely right. International migration is small compared with within-nation migration, but it is still just a human tragedy. And if we get this wrong, if we get the governance of the global food system wrong, what we've seen so far, I just worry, will be as nothing as what we might see in the future.
I very much like this idea, you know, to look into the food system also as the financing system. Keep that in mind, or an energy network. If something goes wrong, it's dark everywhere. And I like also the Cuban mentioning. I was there in 92, 3, 4, and I have studied this a little bit. You know, this was a real disruption of a production system in Cuba because the Russians went out there. I don't know if you know about this story, but the nice thing is that they were forced then to feed themselves, to go into urban gardening, they called it, you know, and having the vegetables grown wherever they could grow it. But the interesting thing was also the outcome, and they looked into the change of diet into the change of health outcome. And you know what? People were healthier. Apparently, that is what medical doctors were saying. So you see, this was a tragedy, and it's still there. And by that, we're going to urban farming. The good thing about urban farming today is that a lot of very young people are into that. And that links, again, you know, young with food, with another way of looking at the production system, and that is only very, very positive. However, with lettuces, with a little bit of salads, with this or that, you don't get the grain, you don't get the bread and the butter on your table by urban farming today. But it's a great way forward. But again, back then to the big mega cities, you cannot feed today with urban farming the mega cities. But also the question is, how resilient is the today, as I said, this very standardized way of feeding people in shanty towns. So I'm also of the opinion that there we are not into a very, very safe situation, and definitely not in a comfort for the next 10 or 20 years to go. And permaculture, as my last remark, I like personally permaculture, but I also, for the time being, see the restriction we have there, because it's extremely labor intensive. You can hardly mechanize permaculture. And that means either you pay much more for, or you get lesser salaries. So the equation on really getting young people, a lot of people, into more permaculture today is not yet there, at least not from the economical side. But, you know, let's help people to go in that direction and then to develop this whole thing, and in 10 or 20 years, it may eventually look much better. So permaculture for the planet, let's say for the natural resource use and taking care of soils, is definitely a good way forward, and it's an outstanding way to learn and to observe much better, again, nature. That is what we have lost a little bit, you know, in agriculture at least, not knowing exactly where stuff is coming from, how it has been produced, and then you go with a generic application of inputs. And that was also one of the questions, you know, if you have a standardized way of producing certain crops, you depend, and there is a great dependency on inputs as well, also definitely on the expected outputs. So trying new ways of production systems, going into a more variation of new diets with new raw materials such as nuts, as berries, and whatever, you know. As I said, it's you to decide. Chocolate is good, but all the berries eventually are better. So go and make your choice and help by that. And that is my, I would say, you know, what can we say? You know, one thing to walk away. Be very conscious about what you eat and ask, where does it come from? What is in this package? And how has it been produced? And if you get the very good and satisfied answer to these 3 questions, you may be a more happier consumer and really contribute to a better change of the food systems for the future.
Thank you. I'm sure in this room we have people from the private sector, public sector, well, certainly academia, development agencies and NGOs. So with 1 minute each to our panelists, in terms of the messaging, just one thing that could be done. And you mentioned earlier, Tom, the public sector. Hans, you will speak on the private sector, 1 minute, and Charles on the educational system, and Jonathan on development agencies, and Susan on NGOs, 1 minute. What can be done? What can they do? Yes.
Okay, I will just say that the system that I'm suggesting already exists, and I think that it was one of the truly significant establishments with regards to global governance, and I think that it just could use a little bit of support. The CG system and the International Agricultural Research Centers linked into the extension systems of individual countries.
Yes, I'll second the comment on the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. And I'd say, yes, in terms of development projects, let us be very careful to listen to the local communities and to the farmers. What do they need? Not what is our model top-down of what is needed by them. Let's get better at listening.
So on NGOs, they have been one of the major groups that have been advancing agroecological techniques in agriculture. So, and they continue to do so, and they continue to be excellent interlocutors between social movements and farmers and the kinds of political needs and economic needs from the state that they can articulate. So, and the other thing is that it is, as far as promulgating alternatives, NGOs have been at the forefront.
Invest in interdisciplinary food system research, bringing together people from the natural sciences, the medical sciences, and the social sciences together.
Yeah, and I think in the private sector, what we have seen that really makes sense is working together. And we have started an initiative that is called Sustainable Agriculture Initiative that is almost running now 15 plus years, where you have many companies in the food industry and traders working in the same direction together, really to help to change farm practices, eradicating the worst ones one by one, and implementing with the farmers new and more resilient and more sustainable farming practices. And you have even here in this building, you have the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, who is exactly doing now the same thing for industry members to tackle now agriculture on global warming and climate change and you name it. And that is the way we can really contribute in a pre-competitive way to induce this change.
Thank you very much to all our panelists for the deep insights that they have given us. And thank you to all of you that came here to listen today. A lot of ground was covered, but there were things that we did not get too deep into. We did not talk about youth in agriculture, for example, in a deep way. But we know that in Africa, for example, they have the most arable land available, but they also have the youngest population. So there is opportunity there as well. We did not go deeply into food diversity, for example, which is another issue. But I think we've covered a lot of ground that give you more food, yes, food, for thought. And hopefully, with all our hearts, minds, and brains together, we will be able to feed everyone now and in the future in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you.